Why this webinar? At NGRI, we have decided to put together this space because even though state oil companies have a huge weight in energy transition in Latin America, they have almost 60% of oil and gas production and are key for the economy, public finance, and the energy decisions. They still have a very small space around debates regarding climate action and sustainable development. From NGRI, we believe that it's very important and necessary to open this conversation for COP30. Now, I'm going to allow myself to introduce our speakers. We have the participation of Ana Carolina González Espinosa, Senior Director of Programs at NGRI. Ana Carolina leads the work of the organization around just energy transition with a special focus on producing regions for oil and gas or regions that are producers of oil and gas and with more than 20 years of experience in governance, resources, climate, and development. Welcome, Ana Carolina. We also have Casio Carvalho, political advisor of the Institute of Socioeconomic Studies, INESC, in Brazil. Casio is a power engineer, master's, and a PhD in energy, and works on social environmental affairs and energy transition with social justice. Welcome, Casio. Hi, and thank you very much. And we have Katia Pua Cornejo, Director of Energy in Mexico Sustainable. More than 50 years, 15 years of experience in energy, environment, human rights, and social participation for the federal government as well as the international initiatives and community initiatives. Thank you very much for your participation, Katia. With these introductions, it is time now to start. We will start giving the floor to Ana Carolina, who will invite us to think about why is it necessary to talk about state companies when we think about fair transition in Latin America. We're all ears, Ana Caro. Thank you very much, Gabi. Thank you very much for your moderation and our guests for joining us in these reflections that without any doubt set forth a question right away, and it is why are we talking about national oil companies or state oil companies when we talk about just transition? And I would like to discuss this during my comments. First of all, why do we do it? What is perhaps the approach that so far that national oil companies have had to this matter? And where can they contribute a lot more? Where these companies can contribute more in the discussions about energy transition, just energy transition. Starting with the question about why we're talking about state-owned oil companies when we talk about just transitions, I say that there are two main reasons. The first, of course, has to do with the weight that these companies have for the national economies, but also for the territorial economies. The national state-owned oil companies are key stakeholders to generate public revenues for many of our countries, but also meet other roles, non-commercial roles related to guaranteeing access to power, or in some cases, fulfill social goals and social objectives. And at a subnational level, where we have the greatest oil production, this role is even more important. For example, generating employment is important. At the subnational level, this is enhanced. They could be sources of employment, very important sources of employment for these territories. For instance, in Mexico, it is stated that 90% of the GDP of the secondary oil sector in these oil regions is linked to Pemex. In Colombia, for instance, through the civil works by taxes, the national company Ecopetrol executes important amounts that are key for the social priorities of the municipalities. And I say in Venezuela as well, PDVSA takes on social programs, etc. But this weight that they have in the economy can be questioned regarding what's happening with the global markets. The International Energy Agency has stated that by 2030, the global demand of fossil fuels can reach a peak, and that puts at risk a great deal of the revenues that can be generated by these companies, many of which have an important percentage to go to export for those global markets. And these risks are being materialized now, are coming true at the subnational level in some regions, that the oil production has been declining. For example, the case of Putumayo, for instance, in Colombia, where production has dropped from 55,000 barrels to 22,000 per day. And it is expected by 2030 drops to 8,000 barrels. And that has important consequences for this that we've just discussed, but also because of the environmental risk that has this possible exit of oil in the territory through social and environmental liabilities that can take place in the case of Loreto, a Peruvian oil region. We're talking about 700 spills that have been documented in the region. That is not very clear who's going to um, take over them. I mean, Peru Petro, for instance, has taken over these assets that were coming from another companies. It is not very clear, though, if they're going to do the partial or full replacement of these environmental liabilities that were left behind by these other companies. And this is happening quite a bit, to the extent that the international companies, the multinational private companies, oil companies, leave behind the assets, and many that take over the assets are the state-owned companies. But the second reason is due to the important social expectations that we have in the territory regarding the actions of these companies. These companies, different to multinational companies and private companies, people see them with different eyes, like they play a different role. And without a doubt, in many cases, it has been the state, the presence of the state, the only presence of the state where the state's presence is precarious other than the oil companies. People have more resistance, or they approach the transition a little bit differently, but also they have different expectations of their role during this transition process. So the national oil companies are also subject for the people not only to see that they have an expectation regarding the decarbonization of their operations, for instance, reducing emissions, etc., that all companies should be doing, but there's an expectation that the state-owned company plays a role in the energy transition. That is, the state of the art of investment in green hydrogen, as it is the case for Ecopetrol, for instance, or reducing methane emissions, as it is the case for Pemex, etc. So, how are the companies, the national oil companies, responding to these expectations and to these new mandates, so to speak? And in this case, we've put together some studies here at NGRI that unfortunately show that still the answer is very shy. I mean, it's very few companies that recognize, first of all, that there's a transition risk, that they can assess it, and that they can draft clear plans regarding those energy transition risks. From 21 companies that we've analyzed in a report a while ago, only 9 of them were recognizing that there's a risk linked to energy transition. Only 4 of them were doing actual assessments to understand those risks, and only 5 mentioned some sort of strategies to mitigate this risk. And what's even worse, none of these 21 companies analyzed had consistent plans for just transition or fair transition. There was, however, though, and it's important to mention, some initiatives for the employees, training programs, education, but not comprehensive frameworks that would look at this transition process comprehensively and exit from oil and gas. And also, more importantly, many of these companies are still investing in hydrocarbons, in spite that some of these assets can have risky conditions, and they have the strategies of diversification that are limited. The differences are very broad from one company to another, and my colleagues can discuss this better than I. But in general, though, the investment in the sector, for example, in renewable energies, are small, not very clear about how much is going to expand that business. And of course, they only focus in diversification of the company as such, but they're not looking in a broad matter the territorial diversification of those local institutions, local entities where they operate. How could this be different? And with this, I want to close my intervention. I don't know how much time I have left, Gavi, but you have 2 more minutes. Okay, great. So how can it be different? Well, there's many things that the national oil companies can do. to support the just transition in producing regions. And number one is transparency. First of all, information. It is very important to start having clarity towards the population, the local authorities, different stakeholders regarding when and how is this exit process going to take place, exiting the territory, phasing out, what are the mature fields that are expected to be closed, what are the timeframes, etc. Second, job planning and economic reconversion for the employees, that is, because we know there are some skills that are very important that can be reused in other sectors, but that requires a reconversion process that includes not only the employees, but other vulnerable populations such as women, youth, and groups that have been marginated and linked to the informal economy of those territories. Third, a participatory process to bring in the community and to bring in the citizens from these territories to debate these transition plans, and including those transition plans also in the commitments of the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. This has to be part of the commitments of the country towards the global energy transition. And fourth, contributing in the process of economic diversification, regional diversification. There's programs, and Casio can talk about some of them, but Petrobras has a program to train people that are vulnerable around energy business sectors that is clean energy. So trying to work towards contributing to the local economic diversification. And finally, the environmental reparation. So to guarantee that the exit takes place with the proper principles for reparation of these environmental and social liabilities that can be left behind by the industry in the territory. And I leave it at that, Gabby, and let's see how we continue moving forward. And this is just a starter for the conversation that Kathy will propose. Thank you very much, Ana Caro, for giving us this landscape view about the role of the state oil companies in the region, and for telling us why are they not only important, but what are the ways in which they could support the just transition for the region. Now I like for us to go to Brazil, and Cassie is here with us that is going to be sharing some of the findings about the use of royalties of Petrobras at different levels of government to see how this works at a local level, and also is going to share some reflections about the local impact of recent changes in the company's portfolio. Cassius' comments will be in Portuguese, so I remind you that if you would like, you can turn on the interpretation channel in Zoom as it was pointed out and as explained in the chat. Cassio, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much, Gabriela. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to ask you for permission to speak in Portuguese. So, let's see here. My name is Casio. I am a political advisor for the Socioeconomic Studies Institute, INESC, in Brazil. And our organization is rooted into analyzing the public budget and everything that it means in terms of the scope of human rights. So, to speak about Petrobras, the main state oil company or the biggest oil company in Brazil, it is important to mention, first of all, that this company today is set up as a mixed economy company. It's got public private participation for its establishment. It has, I mean, even though the Brazilian government is a shareholder and is in charge of the strategy, it does have private participation. And before talking about the royalties and revenues, which is what we've been discussing with Gabriela to bring in the Brazilian outview, is it is important to talk about the geopolitics of oil for Brazil, because Brazil is becoming a more important player in this market of oil and gas, in this global sector of oil, gas for oil trade. But this also has been made possible with what has been shown throughout the years by very large volumes of supply and demand of oil here in Brazil. So, uh, Brazil has more and more for been producing but as well exports, uh, finding itself, as I said before, as one of the main producers of oil in the top 10 around the world. And is that is extremely important to bring it up because here in Brazil there is a collective thinking that this production, this oil supply, not only within the local environment, but also for the trade around the world, that it brings economic development, especially. That's what people think, that this brings economic development to the country. And this is what we discuss, because the history is not so much that we need to address the problems, because there's even a dispute that has taken place in Brazil, Brazilian government itself, that we make viable new oil reserves, especially in the equatorial Brazilian area. So this collective thinking that there's supply, demand, and production of oil, and mostly export of oil, it fosters our social and economic development, is not really so much the case as people think. And we have made an effort, of course, working with other organizations, and especially the Climate Observatory here in Brazil, that have been willing to have this debate. And we have analyzed the oil revenues, because the Brazilian oil revenues that are within a structure or certain design that Petrobras adheres to, but there's other oil companies that are part of this model, of this market, where basically these operate in three different models, so to speak. Concession model. We also have the partnership model. These are onerous in terms of the production supply. And just last year, 2024, these revenues that are the sum of the um, participation, the special participation, and the surplus of oil that has been produced was 138 billion reais. 128 billion reais here in Brazil, and the for these revenues, these are spread out for some different stakeholders, which are the municipalities or the Brazilian states, the union, the Ministry of Science, Innovation, and Technology, and even for the Navy as well, and the Army. So these resources are allocated to these federal authorities, federal institutions, and that's where the challenge comes in for Brazil. For example, oil revenues and royalties is quite focused, concentrated in certain states and municipalities. And to this extent, when these revenues get to these states and municipalities, there is no strategy as such that is aiming so that these municipalities can think about how is it that they are going to do an exit and not being dependent on these revenues. So when we see the direction of the states and municipalities, we see that there's no rules, there's no transparency either, that these revenues are turned into structural public policies, health, education, and even thinking strategically about having these municipalities, that these regions, local regions can prepare, so that when there is, when we do have the need of not depending on these revenues, and that for us, I mean, we have gotten used to seeing it. And an example of this is the municipality of Mosoro in Rio Grande do Norte, where there are certain oil wells offshore in Brazil, oil rigs and platforms in Brazil offshore. Petrobras, during the last uh, administrations of Bolsonaro and Michel Temer, they left the cities, they stopped producing the reserves and the wells, and other private companies did so. So they went into this place, but a drastic reduction of the number of officials, workers, employees, for instance, shows that the dependence, what the dependence is, depending on the revenues and the production of this oil in these cities, municipalities, and states when they went offshore. And how can this bring us to a moment where there's We don't have these revenues anymore for this oil production any longer. Mossorano has been prepared for that at this moment. And we can also see good examples, for example, the Rio de Janeiro municipality throughout the production and based on that production of reserves. Where the social development was not noticed in the municipalities near to Rio de Janeiro. I actually want to be provoking here, and I want to say that the social situation of Rio could even gotten worse with oil companies and oil production. But when we look at the union, I mean, these revenues have not allowed to do many things for our social movement and social and economic development. Just last year, 0.16% of these revenues that I've mentioned, which were, I mean, 138 billion was for environmental climate action for the energy transition. Very little amount. Looking at the potential and the need that we have, that just last year, for instance, was a very difficult year, especially for Brazil, because we had droughts at Rio del Sur, wildfires in the Amazons, and droughts in the Amazons. And even with all of these revenues, very little of these revenues, I mean, it is not well spent, well executed, and it is not executed from the standpoint that it will be withheld, whether it is because of judicialization or because of the lack of criteria at the moment of allocating these resources. So what I wanted to bring you is that these revenues have not been considered as an element that can really help us to have proper development, that we can prepare also so that we do not have this eternal dependence of the supply and production of oil. I try to summarize it as much as I could. I don't know if I've run out of time, but also if any of you would like to have a better grasp and understanding, well, we have a technical note that we have drafted breaking down all of the oil revenues in Brazil that I can share with you. Thank you very much, Casio, for giving us this view about the situation of Brazil and Petrobras, that I believe is always a benchmark for the region in terms of state oil companies, and also to take us to the situation in the territories, in the regions, the impact and the use of the profits. Thank you very much for your contributions, and we will keep in touch in a minute during the seminar. And I'd like us to travel to the north of the continent to Mexico. And for that, I'd like to invite Katia, who will tell us more or will share the out views from the state oil regions where Pemex has a strong presence. Katia, the floor is all yours, and we're here to hear you. Thank you very much, Gabriela, and thank you, Ana Carolina, for setting up this space. And it is a pleasure to share this panel with you, Casio and Ana Carolina. Before diving into this matter, and I'm going to turn this perspective around, and I'm going to talk more about the regions to understand the challenges of the state oil company. Based upon what I'm about to tell you, I just want to give you a little bit of the framework regarding these first comments with certain contextual considerations. The first one is to say that a lot of what I'm going to share right now is the outcome of exploratory research that was done by a Mexican organization of the civil society. It is called Social Innovation and Social Cohesion, with the financial support of NGRI, that wasn't edited as research because it focused in its goal of exploring which were the visions, the interests, the objectives, and the aspirations of those that live on highly dependent territories around energy transition. And that we put together in a very emblematic region that has a lot of dependence, but also emblematic in terms of the importance that the company has had historically there, Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex. But due to the nick of time, I cannot go into the details of this region, but I do want to state that this is an oil producer region that carries out exploration and production of hydrocarbons offshore, even though there's also onshore logistics centers that are related to this market, and has the specificity that of being a region where there's naturally protected areas, is sensitive environmental region, which is a reality of different territories around Latin America, but also that is about a region where we find one of the biggest and more important energy complex in the country. When the production started in the 70s, it even reaches to a peak. I mean, just to have the size of its importance in 2002, 2003, just this complex in front of the coast of Campeche was producing 2.2 million barrels per day, which meant 65% of the total national production of the state oil company Pemex. And now, more specifically, is going through a regime, or better yet, is this is going into decline in this fossil regime, which is linked to the reduction of reserves, as Caro mentioned at the beginning, but also decisions of energy policies, prioritizations, etc. And there's no roadmap that is actually managing this decline of oil production in the region, and that is putting together some sort of de facto transition that is unplanned, which is having consequences in terms of injustices, inequalities that have been historical, that have existed forever, but also generating new social, environmental, and economic consequences added to the others. It is important to set this context because what's happening here shows with a lot of concern what happens when the state oil companies and the state institutions that are not very clearly distinguished within the territories, when these are deployed without responsibility, and what it can mean, the fact that living in a decline or unplanned exit, not only they are not enabling possible futures in these oil regions, but they are alluding to responsibilities to do reparations. So I just wanted to mention this element of context, but my idea is to share 2 points here. The first one is how do we live today this decline that is not managed properly in this producing region? And then, after the visions and everything that we could identify in this research, what is the possible agenda to build a post oil future? And then, for the first matter about how it's being addressed today in these territories. And I think this happens to other regions in our continent as well. I mean, the future without oil and the transition are not abstract possibilities. These are experiences that are being lived, and the exits or the phase outs of the oil sector are highlighted due to loss of jobs, the investments, which has meant that the idea of the oil boom, the promise of development that is linked to the oil activity, is not a collective future that we foresee in these territories. In its place, there's daily experiences, for instance, regarding the decline that have an impact in the means and livelihoods. But also an impact upon how do we set up the identities, the security around these territories, and that are moved by narratives of wearing out, uncertainty, that there are needs of other sorts, of other logical senses. That's where it has been lost. And something else that's happening is that these are territories where I mean, in spite of how structurally precarious these are, many of the assets and the capabilities that are not always recognized, but that are always expressed into organizational practices, organizing the territory, looking for different livelihoods and means that are also taking place at the same time without usually without the support and without a proper consistent strategy, not only from the and oil companies, but from the different administrations and different levels of government. And another core element that we have identified in this study that we did is that the aspirations go beyond monetary income, more, I mean, beyond to think about the redistribution of the effects that the energy transitions usually have. There's a centrality in terms of the agenda towards remediation, restoration, and reparation. I mean, at the same time, we have these two temporary records where There's a felt need to think about the future, yes, but there's very compelling clarity of taking care of the legacies, the past legacies that are seen in a series of liabilities, but more than liabilities, I call them um, years that have been instilled in the collective thinking that require at this moment not just to go through reparation processes, but also guarantees of non-repetition in a energy transformation scenario. So there's much more to say. This is how we see it. That's why I wanted to give you a little bit of the landscape. But in terms of what we've been accomplished to identify as the agendas or the interest from the communities and the people, I want to highlight 5 items only. There is a very important need of putting together historical readings and territorialized readings of the energy regime that is exiting the impacts that it had, the ways of dependency, but there's some ideas about the need to do independent audits, third-party audits, territorial studies about energy inequalities, public records of environmental critical social events. And there's also an interest in some matters around the recognition of the impact and the design for reparation mechanisms to identify whether the damages that have been accumulated to design the reparation strategies that go through a very core matter, which is putting together public funds and private funds for these restoration processes. As far as the third item, there's a very big interest around the idea of having current measures to buffer the fossil fuel phase out to guarantee the social and fiscal stability that Casio spoke about. And in the case of the Mexico, are being noticed in terms of a job creation for youth, also territorial plans for basic infrastructure, basic rates in terms of power supply, for instance. So in the fourth item, there's a lot of interest in terms of how to do institutional redesigns and budgetary designs to correct certain asymmetries that have taken place within the territories themselves, within the oil producing regions. And as a last item, and with this I want to close, Gabby, a core aspect, which is the creation of funds and financial instruments to generate different fiscal schemes that allow to fund for the reparation. And there's a very important matter related to the fact that regarding the omissions from the state company and from the authorities and the institutions of the state itself, there's no structure at this moment that has been designed. Fiscally speaking, there's no financial architecture to take care of these reparation processes. And that is a very key matter within the possible agenda to think about a transition that is just. Amazing. Thank you very much, Katia, for these enriching comments and contributions that has taken us to Mexico, and feeling the experience in the Mexican territories, and especially that evolution of the company's activities and its impact on the population. I would like now, first of all, I'd like to thank our 3 speakers for these first answers and contributions. But before moving on to the questions from the audience that are joining us, I'd like to ask you a couple of things that at NGRI we consider core to this conversation. The first one has to do with the role of the state oil companies in the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, which is a very a very in vogue matter, because precisely this week in New York, there is a summit that is organized by the Secretary General within the framework of the expectations of the presentation of the NDCs. However, though, in spite of the huge weight in terms of emissions and for the economy and everything that the 3 of you have mentioned, state oil companies many times do not show up in these plans, which are basically with national permits to reduce emissions for adaptation to climate change within the framework of the Paris Agreement, something very serious. So I'd like to ask all of you, the 3 of you, what complete actions do you believe that need to be considered regarding these companies within the framework of the NDCs? Let's start with Ana Carolina. Thank you very much, Gabi. What matters most is to include the state oil companies in the indices, which is not happening at all. I mean, these are extremely important. Companies are a huge vehicle of the state in terms of hydrocarbons, and very few indices actually include actions that have to do with these state oil companies as part of the commitments with the climate agenda. So we start from that. And then it has to do more with the decarbonization of the company itself, because while there's a transition process, and let's say that we go in a few decades into a world where there is not as important consumption of oil. We need to guarantee what's produced is produced efficiently and is less contaminating. So there's an important agenda for reduction of emissions in the operations of these companies, and let's say that very importantly, reducing also the methane emissions, right, which are especially harmful, and especially harmful from the standpoint of the communities that are around the oil operations. But on top of this decarbonization agenda, I'd say that there's another matter about thinking what is the role that the national oil company has to fulfill in this new world, post oil world. On one side is the tip of the bow at the territorial level to support this transition process. I mean, the company has been a very important player, but it requires to have a conversation with other stakeholders at the subnational level, with local governments, national government, with the communities, to think about the new lines of prosperity for those oil regions. And I think that the company has an important commitment towards dialogue. It is not the only stakeholder that has to be there, but it is a very important player or actor or stakeholder there. This is key. But then there are some cases that, of course, have the possibility, the financial muscle that is required, and the technical capacity to go into low emission businesses or to work in renewable energy. So, how much are these companies becoming the tip of the arrow in this transformation process? And it's really dependent on the company. There's companies such as Pemex in a very complicated financial situation, but there's other companies like Ecopetrol, as I said before, trying out different low emissions energy, green hydrogen, etc. But it is key that the companies see their business in a different way, trying to go beyond the mistakes from the past of just thinking with a view only on profits and trying to understand how this business contribute to territorial development. But there's an important role that starts with including them, including those companies in the NDCs, that they are part of the NDCs, and also including these just transitioning the NDCs that is not necessarily namely there. Thank you very much, Ana Caro. Casio, what's your take? Well, thank you very much. I understand that it is part of the same logic, not just here in Brazil, but as well as in other countries that we've heard here with Ana Carolina and Katia, that there is no mention or no sort of connection between the oil companies and the NDCs. I mean, it seems like the companies, in our case, Petrobras, are not sitting down at the same table with all of the different stakeholders that are part of deciding the NDCs. They're not sitting at the table with the government that has to propose and set forth the NDCs. There's a separation, there's a distance between the oil companies and the government institutions around the NDCs. In Brazil, the NDCs are established to reduce emissions or to lower the emissions, a gradual elimination of this dependence of oil and its emissions. Petrobras, in the Brazilian case, has made a bet more and more in supply and production, have abandoned other activities, yes, but for a few years now it has been happening, and they promise that for the next period, in the short and midterm, to bet in the production and supply of oil. And when we analyze the strategic plan of the company, we can sense there that this happens because the robust volume of investment is for these activities, for supply and production of oil. And there's no real effort to transform the company to become an energy company more than an oil company, with a higher degree of an effort being made towards research and development and science and technology so that we can reduce our demand, internal demand of oil, for instance, that today is quite large, which is focused on fossil fuels mostly, especially in certain economic segments of the market and economic activities. And this, I mean, when we speak about the revenues, these revenues have gone to the Ministry of Science and Technology and Innovation of Brazil, and it could be helpful for us to invest more and more in the development and technology to phase away from this dependence, but that's not the case. When the profits get to the Ministry of Science and Technology, when the revenues get there and the royalties get there, in spite that is not a lot, this little money that is going there is being used to do research for oil, for more oil production. I mean, we continue along the same lines, the same logic, perpetuating Brazil as an important oil producing country, as I mentioned in the beginning, and this is not connected at all to the NDC. There's this disconnect. So the main company that could be a power company, not just an oil company, has not been in touch and is not connected, as I said before. And as we say in the power sector, there's no interconnection with our climate goals and the proposals that Petrobras has been putting together as a company year to year within their plans, and their concrete actions in Brazil are disconnected. Thank you very much, Casio, for this explanation and for sharing with us this lack of coordination in the case of Petrobras with other institutions that are responsible for moving forward with the climate commitments of Brazil that now are everyday news, are in the news every day. Katia, can you tell us how do you see Pemex and the NDCs? Yes, no, I totally agree with what was mentioned by Ana Carolina to the extent that they're not included. I mean, oil companies are not included at all. In the case of the NDC of Mexico, it has a double dimension that I believe is more strategic. It is not only not having the oil company nor the power companies there either negotiating the NDCs, and there's an important symbiosis there between both of them in terms of the specific goals to reduce the emissions. And I mean, let's not even say that the NDCs do not address these matters that we see are extremely important at the local level, such as considering all of the obligations of reparation, damages, harm, and specific mechanisms to have proper planned management where the infrastructure is being removed. I add that, but I also add the need to think about our NDCs with a territorial justice approach, because what's happening also is that the very company that doesn't have certain obligations of specific reductions, etc., um, works differently in different territories. So there are certain places where it is a company that has a series of activities that are profitable, that are commercial, that mean partnerships with private companies. But I'm thinking more, given what I shared, that if we don't accomplish in our NDCs to include the territorial justice approaches, perhaps in those regions where there's no production anymore, where de facto there's a situation of removal and decline of oil production. I mean, we'd be pretty much left without the possibility to have a specific commitment about how do we take care of the damages, accumulated damages. Is an example, but I believe that our NDCs in terms of the state companies, state oil companies also need to diversify their own outview within the territories themselves. So I'd say those items, Gabriela. Yes, thank you very much for your contribution, Katia. And I mean, I would like to take advantage that I'm moderating this panel. I'd like to ask a second question, but before that, I'd like to invite the participants to put their questions in the chat. I think we have one or two questions, but if you have any questions or any comments, you can type them in the chat and we will address them. And the reason why I want to ask a second question is to take this conversation once again to the territories, to the local level. And for me, once again, a fundamental matter in this debate is local funding. Historically, just as the three of you have mentioned, the state companies have been a key source of resources for municipalities, local governments, and for the producing economies. However, though, these profits have not been used wisely, but have been there though, and have been and still are important. So, in the landscape that we are facing, these profits are going to be coming down. These revenues will come down with the energy transition. And there's an interesting question about how is it that we need to have a debate regarding how we're going to cover the gap and how to guarantee equity in the territories and that we do not lose social services, but we can, let's say, put the light still or turning on the light in the territories to have power in the territories. I like to ask this question to the three of you before opening the floor to the questions from the audience, from the attendees. I'd like to start with Ana Carolina again. Thank you very much, Gabby. This is a very important question because for me, fiscal resilience is one of the main lines of this process of just transition in the territories, and especially in those territories that for years have lived from oil profits and oil revenues. And I say that this is one of the main reasons why the transition has to start now. And it has to start now because there's still resources. I mean, people sometimes say that, well, no, we cannot think about the post-oil world because there's still oil and there's going to be oil. Yes, of course, precisely. There's still oil and there's still profits that get there. And it is the moment where we still have the resources to use them for that transition when we need to start planning this transition, especially if the outview is that it is going to take place. And the truth is that it will take place. It will take place in some cases earlier, in some cases later, but it will take place. It will happen. So this is one of the main reasons of the urgency, the need to have a fiscal resilience. This takes decades. It's not going to be done over 1 year, nor is it a resource that we replace. We change oil and now we start selling avocado this and everything will be replaced with one single source. It is very likely that replacing this type of revenues and royalties that have been so important is not accomplished with one single source of income. And that's why I say the tip of the arrow or the state of the art will be the territorial economic diversification, the capability of the territories to generate greater revenues, to reduce the dependence on third party transfers that are important in these territories is going to be very important. But not just that, I mean, that most likely will have to go along with a state action, with a state commitment to guarantee that at least there are some basic needs and some basic services that allow for the service provision to look for alternative resources. And I also say that in many cases, Gabriela and colleagues, there has been an issue of inefficiency, Casio, I think you mentioned in terms of the resources not being spent correctly. It's not that there's no resources, but how they're executed. We have resources from different sources, but they're used in projects in an isolated fashion, non-strategic projects, and not necessarily with the intent of having this capability to diversify the economy. So there has to be a deliberate action to see with a lens which are the projects that we're funding with the resources that we still have in the territories. And finally, I'd say that there is a very important commitment of the international community. I mean, it cannot be that we have all of these commitments. These are the regions that have produced the energy of the world for more than a century, right? So there is a commitment, the ethical commitment from the international community to support a just transition and a process of economic reconversion and productive reconversion in those regions that have provided power to the world for so many years. Thank you very much, Ana Caro. Very powerful comments. Casio, what do you think? Well, I have a point of view regarding what Ana Carolina has just said. I agree, but however, though, in the Brazilian case, as you might know, we have a great renewable energy potential. I mean, that goes beyond the power grid that, I mean, has a history of renewal by the hydropower. Um, However, though, when we think about diversifying our economy so that we don't depend on fossil fuels today, for example, Brazil is not, I mean, if we compare it to Venezuela, that has this dependency, I mean, almost comprehensive dependency on oil or full dependency on oil. But the case of Brazil is different. It's not the same because we have, for instance, the agribusiness, soy mining as well, that are part of the economic diversification, but also generate some sort of dependence. So, what we have seen here at Ineski is that we need to leverage these windows of opportunity by using this oil revenues and royalties to even diversify more our economy, as Ana Carolina said, but also looking at the problem of being becoming dependent of this new economy. I mean, we should not perpetuate for us to continue prioritizing or establishing this economy coming first. For example, the green hydrogen, if it could become viable, or for us to only produce. Or to be set up as a country that comes to host these data centers as it's happening, which we've seen a lot in Brazil. And we need to relocate into this global restructuring, and that's important regarding what could happen with the energy transition. So, aside from the economic diversification, we have spoken about the need to think about this concept or this idea of perpetuating this prioritization of our economy, taking advantage of this window of opportunity. Great. Thank you very much, Cassie. Just as you mentioned, from an economy that is already highly diversified, then what would be the strategies that could be considered for Brazil? Katia, the floor is yours. Well, I would add to what you have stated a word of caution, a word of caution in terms of thinking about how do we want to foster these productive and economic diversification models, under what paradigms, so that we do not think that a region that has produced power that is suffering the effects of decades of oil and gas production tomorrow will become a territory that can undertake extractivist projects, not only power, but also reproducing these sort of models, because we now see, okay, we phase out from oil to tourism, which tourism bulk and massive tourism or to renewables. So which renewable? Well, super green hydrogen plants, or in the case of Carmen, to the alternative, which is planting oil, palm oil. So this is put on the table, but I want to give you a word of caution that perhaps diversification, economic diversification, and productive diversification can continue reproduce certain paradigms that have are more extractivist and causing harm to the territories. And I'd like to add to what has been mentioned. Of course, there's a very important agenda that we have been able to consolidate in Mexico and in the region around transparency, the proper use of resources, access to information. It is amazing how the people in the territories do not necessarily have clarity about how the public resources are used that are coming from the oil activity, and that this agenda that we need to continue working on around transparency, governance of the revenues, etc. I believe we also need to open a new one for public funds that are specifically labeled for diversification processes, for productive and economic diversification, for reparation processes, for financial instruments that are different, trust funds for territorial restitution, responsible exit bonds with rules of engagement for specific projects. I mean, these are some things that we have been discussing, talking about, and trying out around the region, and we need to work at the same time. So to continue with our transparency agenda of the way that we're doing it, but in the others, start thinking about a different financial architecture, right? And I believe that there is a matter here, for instance, that we have been discussing here and there, that has to do with responsible exit bonds. There's some um, window of opportunity, but that's what I would say, Gabby. Thank you very much, Katya. You have given us a lot to think about. And now I'd like to try to invite you all to reflect about some of the questions that have been texted in the chat from our participants. The first question is from Megan Darby, and she's asking, why is it that state oil companies resist or reject the idea to manage the transition risk, the stock assets or sunk assets strategies, or who's managing this strategy of these aspects? This is something that the three of you have discussed. And I put this question on the table, but for the nick of time, I'm going to um, shorten the other questions because there's another question about green industrialization and how do you see these prospects. There's also a question about how to reconvert business models from state oil companies towards renewable energy. This transformation of going from producing oil to renewable energy. And there's also another question guided to the reparations that I believe is something that, in a way, the three of you have spoken about, but also is extremely important to the extent about how shall we not continue reproduce the same exclusion, inequality dynamics, inequity, and abusing the environment. So how do we have a fundamental change in this opportunity that presents us with a fair transition? Just in a few seconds, let's try to answer some of these questions in any way possible. Okay, I can go ahead and get started. Yes, please. So I'm gonna trying to answer first the first couple of questions. I believe that in the Brazilian case, we have established, first of all, that we have this global breakthrough uh, the war. There was a concentration of need from other countries of importing our oil, and this is here is national breakthrough. This is seen here as an opportunity given that we have some of the studies and the national agency shows that the peak of demand is coming closer to us. And I see this as an opportunity, and it is an opportunity to bring in other revenues, other income, looking at this high consumption, and at a certain point within the next period, this consumption can start being reduced. Now, however, though, when we see the industry and the effort to have a green industrial economy, we can actually even see some of the cases here in Brazil. There's some strategies that the Lula government has established. However, that we do not have that coordination with the Petrobras strategy. I mean, it is very guided towards understanding this global breakthrough that is understood as unique. Here in the Brazilian case, I believe this is it. It is a global movement that is getting started, and there's a lack of articulation between the government, its plans, and the main oil company, which is Petrobras. Thank you very much, Casio. Any other comments regarding these questions that were asked, whether it is Katia or Ana Carolina? Yeah, there's many questions. It's very difficult, but I want to discuss what Ana Carolina mentioned regarding the NDCs and all of this process for year closing that we're going through. We're talking a lot about these matters. I believe that we do need to continue to consolidate this dialogue around that these are state and these are companies, right? I mean, I think a lot of the specific case of Pemex, and to that extent, they have a different obligation. They have a greater obligation of taking on certain obligations and challenges from the legal standpoint, but also, though, from the political standpoint. I mean, these have to be the tip of the arrow when it comes to this work of energy transition. So bringing them into the debate, to the center of the debate, and start pushing from there, I think this is core and this is key for the region. So that's what I'd say. That's what I take from this webinar. That is the importance that we do not let go of the conversation about the different role that they play and they must have. Excellent. Thank you, Ana Carolina. Any words to finish up? Well, I just want to say that what you mentioned regarding the resistance of the companies, it also has to do with the dilemmas that these type of companies face, because at the end, there is a protection mandate of their revenues, but there's also other non-commercial mandates of assuring the energy provision, the provision of oil as well, which still remains in the country, and NGRI is precisely working in a framework that could leverage or help us guide the sort of questions that the national oil companies, as well as the governments and the citizens that need to be mindful of the actions of these companies, need to address to balance out how to protect these revenues and how to promote the ambition of green industrialization. But I leave it at that to continue later. So thank you very much. Of course, there's a lot to still talk about. I'd like to thank our amazing panelists, Ana Caro, Casio, and Katia, for your clear and enriching contributions, and all of the people that joined us today at NGRI. We wanted to have this first webinar matching the General Assembly of the United Nations and the Climate Week in New York, because as we said at the beginning, it is key to expand and to deepen into this conversation of state oil companies in the just transition. And I believe that this webinar has helped us to have a first approach. There's still a lot more to do. This is the first of three different seminars, and our colleague Emma is putting the links and the details for you to join us. I also like to thank our interpretation team, because it's important to have this conversation in different languages, to truly understand ourselves, to learn from each other. Thank you very much to our interpreters for their help, and to all of those that have followed from different countries in Latin America, especially Africa and Europe as well. Thank you very much for your interest in Latin America, and we will see you next time. Appreciate it. Take care. Thank you very much to all. Thank you. Thank you. Take care.